Ethan had heard about the village long before he ever considered visiting it. People called it the Silent Village because it had been abandoned for decades, left to decay in the shadow of the surrounding mountains. Some said it had been a place of misfortune, a cursed town where the people had simply vanished one night without a trace. Others spoke of strange lights, eerie figures, and unearthly noises that filled the streets on certain nights. But Ethan, an amateur explorer, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He saw it as a perfect opportunity to document something forgotten by time, a place where few had dared to go. With his camera gear and supplies packed, Ethan set off toward the village. The hike was long, the trail winding through dense woods and rocky paths. As the sun began to set, the air around him cooled, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. Finally, after hours of trekking, he reached the outskirts of the village. It was smaller than he had imagined, just a few rows of houses, an old church, and a well at the center of the town square. The buildings were weathered, their wood warped from years of exposure, roofs caved in, and windows shattered. Despite the age, everything looked untouched, as though the villagers had left in the middle of their daily lives. Ethan took out his camera, excited to capture the eerie beauty of the place. As he moved through the village, he noticed a strange stillness. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, and no sound from the wildlife. It was as if the entire world had paused around him. The only sound came from his boots crunching against the overgrown grass. His first stop was the well in the center of the village. Peering over the edge, he shone his flashlight into the darkness below. The light didn't reach the bottom. The well seemed impossibly deep, and a strange, musty odor wafted up from it. Shrugging it off, he moved on to the nearest house. Inside, the house was mostly intact. A dining table still stood in the center of the room, with plates and cups laid out as if a meal had been interrupted. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed, yet nothing seemed broken or out of place. He began to feel uneasy. There was no sign of chaos, no hurried departure. It was as if the village had been frozen in time. As the daylight began to fade, Ethan decided to set up camp in one of the larger houses. He chose a house at the far end of the village, which had 2 stories and a view of the surrounding forest. The roof had collapsed in some places, but it felt sturdier than the others. He set up his sleeping bag in a corner of the main room, took out his flashlight, and lit a few candles he had brought with him. Despite the flickering light, the darkness outside pressed against the windows, making the room feel small and claustrophobic. As he ate a quick meal, Ethan thought he heard something, a faint noise, like a distant murmur. He paused, listening carefully, but the sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was just the wind or his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, abandoned places had a way of making you feel watched, even when there was no one around. But the feeling grew stronger as the night deepened. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the candles seemed amplified, and the silence outside was almost suffocating. Around midnight, as Ethan was reviewing the photos he had taken, he heard it again, the faint murmur, but closer this time. It sounded like voices, muffled and indistinct, as if they were coming from somewhere deep within the village. He stood up, listening intently. The murmur grew louder, and now it was unmistakable. Someone was speaking, though the words were unintelligible. Grabbing his flashlight, Ethan stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The village was cloaked in darkness, the moon barely visible behind a layer of clouds. He followed the sound, moving cautiously through the streets. No matter how far he walked, the voices seemed to remain just out of reach, always a little further ahead. Eventually, he found himself back at the well. The voices seemed to be coming from within it, echoing up from the depths. His heart raced as he peered over the edge once more, his flashlight illuminating nothing but the void below. The murmurs were clearer now, more distinct, but still too muffled to understand. Without thinking, Ethan leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. Then, suddenly, a gust of wind rose from the well, cold and unnatural, blowing out his flashlight. Panicked, he stumbled backward, falling onto the ground. The village around him seemed to shift, the air growing colder and heavier. The voices stopped. In the oppressive silence that followed, Ethan heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned his head, the beam of his dead flashlight still clutched tightly in his hand. At first, he saw nothing but the shadows of the crumbling buildings. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Standing at the far end of the street, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a long, dark cloak that blended into the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Ethan could feel its gaze on him, cold and penetrating. Paralyzed with fear, Ethan didn't know what to do. The figure took a step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Ethan scrambled to his feet, backing away slowly, never taking his eyes off the figure. But no matter how far he backed up, the figure seemed to get closer. His mind raced. He needed to get out of the village, but the path was long and dark, and there was no telling how many more of these things were out there. Desperate, he turned and ran toward the house where he had left his gear. As he ran, the village seemed to change around him. The buildings loomed larger, darker, and the streets seemed to twist and turn in ways they hadn't before. The air grew colder still, and the sound of footsteps echoed all around him. He burst into the house, slamming the door behind him. But the moment he did, he heard it again, the murmurs, now louder, filling the air inside the house. They were coming from everywhere at once, surrounding him. His flashlight flickered back to life, but the light was weak, barely cutting through the thick shadows that now filled the room. Panic set in as Ethan heard the door creak behind him. He spun around, expecting to see the cloaked figure, but there was nothing. Just the open door, leading out into the pitch-black night. But then, from the shadows at the far end of the room, the figure emerged, its face still hidden, moving slowly toward him. The murmurs grew louder, turning into whispers, then wails, as more figures appeared from the corners of the room. Their hollow eyes watching him, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Ethan backed into a corner, his body trembling with fear. There was no escape. The figures closed in, their hands reaching out toward him. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of their presence pressing down on him.